Some hearts are so dark, not even the brightest light can change them. Some minds so twisted, it's hard to believe a human being can concoct such evil. But today's story is about a man who delved deeper and darker into his own provisions than many of the worst murderers in history. For over 2 decades, this killer ravaged through the German North, leaving a bloody trail in his wake and evading the eyes of police until he made a fatal mistake. This is the story of Joachim Kroll, the Duisburg cannibal. Welcome to Minute Murders, where we bring you bite-sized stories of true murders you can take on the go. Come and get your daily dose of true crime. Though not widely known, Joachim Kroll was one of the darkest and most prolific serial killers of the last 100 years. And unlike other killers with a rap sheet of similar crimes, Kroll was not the most imposing man. People described him as small, mousy, and nondescript. He was socially awkward and he had very little luck with the opposite sex. Starting at a young age, people called him slow and unintelligent. According to his early teachers, Kroll had an IQ of 76, well below average. Kroll was born on April 17, 1933 in modern-day Poland. He was born the son of a miner and a stay-at-home mother, and the 6th of 9 children. His father beat and abused him as a child, which no doubt contributed to Kroll's aversion toward other people and his general lack of self-esteem. Kroll was bullied in school by the other children for being socially awkward and slow. At the age of 10, he was drafted into the Hitler Youth, a sadistic program to shape Germany's rising generation to fit Hitler's model for a perfect society. Joachim didn't fit in here either. He was ridiculed by his teachers for being soft and quiet. He didn't fit the mold that the Hitler Youth was trying to force him into. So here begins the common pattern among killers. Kroll was an outcast from the very beginning. It was these feelings of alienness and isolation that would transform Kroll from an awkward child into a monster of a man. Evil does not appear in a vacuum, nor does it spring up without being watered. Darkness is merely the absence of light, and Kroll's life was devoid of any light. His father, already a hardened man from working as a miner, fought and died in World War II. With the absence of a man in home, Kroll's mother moved the family to a new town and a smaller home. Joachim was forced to drop out of school to help with the farm and to work to keep the family afloat. He only completed school up until the 3rd grade. It was during this time that Kroll developed many of his dark proclivities. The farm animals were often slaughtered brutal in these days, and Kroll found himself intrigued by their deaths. He would describe it later as a funny feeling he had when he saw pigs and cows being butchered for food. Investigators and psychologists would later realize that this was the beginning of a sexual attachment to violence. Joachim would act on these feelings and butcher local cats and other small animals because, as he put it, he wanted to see what their insides looked like. Already, Kroll had developed an unnatural attachment to violence and maiming living things. He received some sort of sexual gratification from seeing blood, guts, and the horror of death. These feelings and attractions would only deepen as time went on, and as Kroll further distanced himself from other people. Kroll understood that there was something wrong with him, but in spite of this, he tried to create connections with other people, though he could only hide the monster lurking within for so long. In 1955, when Joachim was 22, he met a waitress at a local bar and invited her to the cinema with him. He and the woman returned to his apartment. But Kroll was so socially repressed, he had no idea what to do under the circumstances. Kroll attempted to have sex with her, but prematurely ejaculated. The woman left and Kroll's shame fell deeper into his isolation. During the same year, Kroll's mother died, and this triggered a psychotic break in him. The one person who stood by him, who perhaps was able to understand him, was gone. Kroll was forced to move out on his own, no longer under the watchful and caring eye of his mother. He's a lone man in the world now, but it's the world, not Kroll, who should be worried. Joachim committed his first murder in the winter of 1955. He led 19-year-old 𝚑𝚘 𝚑𝚘 to a barn, promising her a gift. Once inside, Kroll strangled 𝚑 and stabbed her repeatedly. And as was characteristic of all of his murders, Kroll raped her dead body afterwards. When police discovered her body and her remains had been disemboweled and strewn across the barn floor, Kroll was reenacting what he had seen done to the farm animals of his youth, except this time it was an innocent young woman. The crime scene was so gruesome. Police suspected several people had committed the murder. 𝚑 was the first in a long string of murders Kroll would commit over the next 2 decades. He was extremely skilled at avoiding capture because he always traveled to find his victims. It was this distance that prevented local authorities from realizing who was committing the murders. For years, the Duisburg cannibal operated under anonymity, while others were punished for his crimes. Another of Kroll's victims, the 24-year-old Clara Tesmer, was murdered near the Rhine River in June 1959. Kroll, who was walking beside her on a trail, tried to grab her arm, but she resisted. He struck her on the head and they tumbled down into the brush. Tesmer struggled, but Joachim strangled her to death. Her body was found the next day by 5 boys riding their bikes. Police once again were at a loss, but they suspected a man named Heinrich Ott was behind it. Ott was a local mechanic and had a daughter himself. He was falsely convicted, jailed, and eventually hung himself while imprisoned. Kroll's victims were not only the women he assaulted, but the men whose lives were uprooted and even ended by his violence. The full extent of his damage may never be known, as not even Kroll could remember the locations of all of his victims' bodies. But his kill list only grew as the years went on. Another victim to Kroll's madness was the 16-year-old Manila Knott, murdered only a month after Tesmer. Kroll strangled Knott and raped her dead body in the city park of Essen. Police later reported finding semen on her face, hair, and pubic area. Knott also had patches of flesh missing from her thighs and buttocks. The police found the crime to be so gruesome, they assumed a gang of perverts had performed the act. Even after these murders, and with the starkly inhuman way they were carried out, police didn't realize they had a serial killer on their hands. They assumed these were isolated incidents given the distance of the victims and the times at which their bodies were discovered. But Kroll couldn't evade capture forever. In 1976, Kroll was living in the town of Lahr, a small suburb. He was seen as a friendly and quiet man by his neighbors. He had an affinity for playing with the nearby children, but the other adults never saw a problem with this since he struck them as a gentle and quiet man. The children even called Kroll Uncle Joachim, since he would often bring them candy, toys, and other treats. At this time, Kroll lived alone and worked as a bathroom attendant for a nearby public toilet. At this time, Kroll developed circulation problems in his legs and was largely immobile for a while. He had a dilemma: satisfy his urge to murder or wait until he could move freely again. Unfortunately, he couldn't resist his sick urges, and on July 3rd, 1976, he led a local girl into his apartment with the promise of giving her sweets. Marion Ketter was only 4 years old. Her parents immediately noticed her absence and notified local police, but they waited a whole 24 hours before beginning the search. Officers arrived in Kroll's neighborhood the next day and began asking the residents about a young Marion. Eventually, they found Kroll's downstairs neighbor, Oscar. He had no knowledge of where Marion was, but he mentions a strange conversation he had with Kroll earlier in the day. Oscar had confronted Kroll about a blocked pipe, and Kroll's only response was that he gutted a rabbit and stuffed the guts down the toilet. Kroll had promised to unclog the toilet by disposing of the guts in a nearby trash can. The police went to investigate said can, but what they found made their skin crawl. Inside were the intestines and inwards of a small human, certainly not an animal as small as a rabbit. They went to Kroll for questioning, and to their surprise, he admitted to everything on the spot. Kroll took the police to his freezer, where he had placed the cut body parts of Mary and 𝚑𝚘𝚍. They went to the stove where the girl's severed hand was boiling in a pot of water with carrots and potatoes. They arrested Kroll immediately, and the macabre nature of this crime led them to believe that this wasn't the first time he had murdered like this. But if they only knew. While in custody, the police tried to question Kroll about his motives and if he had done anything similar in the past. Kroll was silent. His lifetime in the darkness, keeping himself from others, had left him severely socially stunted. But the lead detective devised a different approach. He would build a rapport with Kroll, and perhaps his newfound trust would persuade the killer to open up. The detective asked Kroll about what he liked and disliked, his upbringing and hobbies, and little by little, like an onion whose layers are peeled, Kroll started talking. He told him the stories of the many murders he committed over the last 20 years and how he would rape and eat his victims. Kroll revealed that he was never able to develop a sexual attraction for a woman who was conscious. He would only become aroused at the sight of an unconscious and unresponsive woman. Or worse, the sight of a woman physically mutilated. Because of this, Kroll kept a sex doll for years that he would use to gratify himself. But when the urges became too overwhelming, he would go hunt for a fresh victim. Police were also acutely curious as to why Kroll ate his victims. Rape and murder were one thing, but to cannibalize your victims was another. Kroll said he did it to save on grocery bills, but there's a conjecture to the story. Other reports state that Kroll couldn't stand the taste of animal meat, that he only enjoyed the taste of human flesh. To make it worse, the flesh of those who were young. What's more likely is that Kroll's mental problems and traumatic upbringing led to those destructive perversions. Whether sexual or otherwise, Kroll was attuned to getting pleasure from the pain of others. Eventually, the police allowed Kroll out of jail to show them the locations of where he had committed his crimes. Kroll couldn't remember town names or addresses, but he had a certain affinity for remembering absurd landmarks, even years later. A certain bush or rock in a forest would trigger a memory, and it could reenact the crime scenes with a female officer. The police department was able to close a number of cases that were never closed, and provide solace to the families of many victims. Even then, there were several bodies that Kroll couldn't lead them to, and till this day remain in German wilderness. Even more bizarre is the fact that Kroll was under the impression that his confinement would lead to a surgery that would get rid of his homicidal urges, then he could be set free. In the end, Joachim Kroll was charged on 8 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. He received 9 life sentences in prison. Kroll was convicted in April of 1982 and spent 9 years in prison before dying of a heart attack in 1991. Many that hear this story believe it was too easy of an out for a man who terrorized so many of the most vulnerable. Whatever your stance, it's undeniable that Joachim Kroll represented some of the worst that humankind has to offer and was one of the vilest killers to walk this earth. Written by Sebastian Lacoste and hosted by Chris Oxendine.